I slid the single key across the glass table, and it made no sound on its journey to her. It was a simple, sterile object that represented the final transaction of our marriage. Before us, the divorce papers were fanned out in a perfect arc, each one initialed in my neat architectural script. Paz sat across from me, a coiled spring of impatience in a leather jacket, her boot tapping a frantic rhythm against the polished concrete floor. The silence between us was a weapon we had both become experts at wielding. Faint sirens rose from the city below, a common sound on a Friday afternoon that I had trained myself to ignore. That morning, my phone had buzzed with an emergency alert, something about a new flu variant and overwhelmed hospitals, but the text was garbled with political messaging about protest curfews. I dismissed it as another system failing, more noise in a city that was already too loud. My focus was on this room, on this final, necessary procedure. Biaja Quain, the mediator, sensed the finality. She was a small woman, all sharp angles and expensive fabric, and she slid a box of tissues between us with a practiced weariness. "After 30 years of this, you learn one thing," she sighed. "It doesn't matter who was right or wrong. All that matters is who you can trust to help you hide the body." She offered a small, cynical wink. The joke landed in the quiet room with the weight of a stone, a darkly perfect prophecy. I saw Paz flinch, her jaw tightening, because the statement captured the absolute truth of our situation. There was no trust left. It was time to divide the last of our things. I had already organized my life without her, a new system built on cleaner lines. "For your new apartment," I said, my voice flat. "I've had the locks changed at the house." I stated it as a fact. Another item checked off my list. For Paz, I knew this was the final act of control, another blueprint she never got to see. Her fury, which had been simmering for an hour, finally boiled over. Her hand closed around the only nearby object with any real substance, a heavy, fist-sized glass paperweight. It sat on the table as a solid symbol of the immense pressure that had crushed our marriage. Her knuckles turned white. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, a man's scream, terrified and animalistic, cut through the office's thick soundproofing. The scream was followed by a wet, percussive thud. A man in a blood-soaked business suit slammed against the floor. To ceiling glass wall beside me, his hands scrabbling for a moment before he was violently yanked out of sight. Outside our window, the ordered world of traffic and commerce had become a scene of pure pandemonium. Biaja gasped and scrambled to the reinforced office door, fumbling with the keypad. She could see the horrors unfolding in her reception area. Just as the heavy door swung shut, a spray of arterial blood from the hallway carnage jetted through the narrowing gap, misting across her face and her expensive pantsuit. She stumbled back, sealing the door with a final, heavy thunk. "Just a riot," she said, her voice shaking as she forced a smile. "We're safe in here." My own training kicked in. I pulled out my phone to look for building schematics, for exit routes, but there was no service. My system for gathering information had failed instantly. Paz was not looking at her phone. She was staring at Biaja. As an ER nurse, she saw things I did not. She saw the blood not just on the mediator's suit, but dotting her lips, caught in the corner of her eye. I saw a flicker of professional recognition in Paz's expression, a look I had seen 100 times when she came home from the hospital. "It's in her eyes," Paz whispered. The words meant only for me. Like that first patient in the ER this morning, the one who coded in 30 seconds. Biaja must have heard her, or perhaps she just felt our eyes on her. She touched her face, saw the red on her fingertips, and her professional mask crumbled into panic. She turned and fled into her private bathroom, slamming the door behind her. At that exact moment, the main power in the building died. The soft office lights went out, replaced by the hum of emergency power and the sickening, rhythmic pulse of red safety strobes. The magnetic lock on the main door gave a loud click, sealing itself permanently. We were trapped with the coming storm. A low, guttural moan came from behind the bathroom door. It was followed by a series of wet, choking sounds, and then a violent thrashing, like an animal caught in a trap. The doorknob began to rattle, not with the turn of a human hand, but with a frantic, spasmodic shaking. The person who was Biaja was gone. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to formulate a defensive position. "We have to corner it," contain it. Paz knew containment was not an option. She looked at me, her eyes wide in the flashing red light, then down at the heavy glass paperweight still clutched in her hand. For a single lucid moment, a decade of resentment evaporated, replaced by a shared and primal understanding. She mouthed the words, "The head." The bathroom door burst open. The thing that had been Biaha came out, a blur of frenzied aggression in a ruined pantsuit. Paz reacted instantly, shoving a sleek office chair into its path. The improvisation gave me a half-second. I used physics, tackling it from the side and driving it against the glass wall. It was pinned for a moment, snarling, its teeth snapping inches from my face. Paz stepped forward and brought the paperweight, the object that had almost been a weapon between us, down on the back of its skull. The sound was a sickening mixture of cracking bone and shattering glass. The thing went limp, and the only sounds left were our own ragged breaths and the relentless, silent flash of the emergency lights. "We need the first aid kit from the main office." Paz spoke to the emergency strobe light, not to me. My own plan was already formed, a clean line of logic drawn through the chaos of the last hour. The server room on the 35th floor was the only viable sanctuary, a windowless box with a single, reinforced entry point and its own climate control system. It was the optimal solution. Her suggestion was a variable I had not accounted for, an unnecessary risk. I explained the schematics of the server room to her, the logic of its defensible space, the clear priority of securing a fortress before we worried about supplies. "You can't plan for a cut artery," she said, already moving toward the glass doors that separated the reception area from the vast, open-plan office. I told her it was a foolish deviation from the primary objective. She ignored me, pushing through the doors into the cavernous space. Refusing to be left alone in this blood-stained hallway, I followed, my hand clutching the heavy base of the lamp we had taken from Biaggia's office. My job was to be her lookout while she engaged in this pointless scavenger hunt. She moved with a nurse's efficiency, checking desk drawers and a supply closet before finding a large white box with a red cross on it under a manager's desk. As she stood, we heard a crash from the direction of the server room. We found the door ajar. Inside, the air was cold and filled with the low whir of cooling fans. A young man in a company polo shirt was huddled between two black server racks. He was alive and terrified, and that was all that mattered until he lunged. He wasn't fast like the others, just clumsy and desperate. I shoved him back with the lamp and he stumbled, his arm catching the edge of a server panel that had been knocked loose. The metal edge was sharp. It sliced across my left forearm as I brought my arm up to defend myself, a deep, clean gash from wrist to elbow. Paz drove the corner of the first aid box into the back of his neck, and he crumpled to the floor. She had me sitting on an overturned chair before I could fully process what happened. She worked quickly, her hands sure and steady as she cleaned the wound and applied pressure. My charcoal gray suit jacket was ruined, stained with my own blood. She used supplies from the kit she insisted on getting, wrapping my arm in a tight, clean white bandage. The irony was not lost on me. My perfect plan had failed on first contact with reality, and her impulsive detour had just saved me from bleeding out or getting infected. She finished her work, tying off the bandage. "Are you sure he didn't get you? Not a scratch?" I hesitated for a moment before I answered, checking my skin for any break that was not my own. The main stairwells were impassable, choked with the infected. My knowledge of the building's blueprints offered another path, an executive fire stairwell that was only accessible through the law firm on the 24th floor. We found the double doors to the firm barricaded with a heavy reception desk. A man with a rifle watched us from the other side. He was Morgan Chen, the firm's senior partner, a man whose paranoid prepping I had once read about in a magazine profile. The rifle he held was the same high-caliber hunting rifle from a framed photograph on his office wall, the one where he posed over a dead stag in the Scottish Highlands. Now it was pointed at my chest. I tried to reason with him, explaining our shared interest in survival and the strategic value of cooperation. He was unmoved, his eyes darting between us and the hallway behind us. Paz noticed his cracked lips and the slight tremor in his hands. She stepped forward, holding up the 2 remaining bottles of water we had taken from Biaha's office. She did not offer them for passage. "We want the rifle." Chen stared at her. "You need to survive tonight," she continued. "We need to survive the next 23 floors." He considered her offer, his gaze fixed on the water. Finally, he nodded. He pushed the heavy rifle through a gap in the barricade, and I passed him the bottles. As the trade was completed, he gestured with his head toward a locked office down the hall. We could hear a soft whimpering from inside. My associate was bitten. "I can't." He reached into his pocket and produced a single brass bullet, holding it out to us. "I'll give you this as a bonus if you solve my problem." We looked from the bullet to the locked door, then back to his terrified face. We refused, leaving him alone with his decision. We now had a powerful weapon, but one less bullet than we might have had. We made it down the executive stairs to the 12th floor. The exit door was blocked. Someone had barricaded it from the other side with steel file cabinets, but the barricade had been breached. The metal door was bent inward, and through the gap we could see a dozen of them, clawing, their weight straining the hinges. Our safe route was gone. We were trapped. Through a large, shattered window, I saw the window washing rig. I calculated the probabilities in my head. The cable looked frayed, the motor on the roof was probably damaged from the power surge, and the platform itself was swinging in the wind. I estimated a 50% chance of catastrophic structural failure. It was too risky. Paz looked at the fire door, which was beginning to splinter under the relentless pressure from the horde. She saw a 100% chance of death if we stayed. My plan was the only way, a desperate measure that hinged on a trust that no longer existed between us. One of us would have to descend on the rig first, land on a lower balcony, and then send the rig back up. This meant one of us would be left alone and completely defenseless on the 12th floor, their life entirely in the other's hands. Paz volunteered to go first. She climbed over the shattered windowsill and onto the metal platform. I worked the controls and the rig began its jerky descent. It reached the 10th floor balcony and she scrambled off. Just as her feet touched the concrete, the motor above us sparked, sputtered, and died. The platform went dark. I was alone, 12 stories up, with the sound of the horde breaking through the door behind me. I called her name into the darkness. There was only silence from below. Minutes passed that felt like hours. Then I heard a grinding noise. The rig began to move, rising slowly. She was cranking it back up to me by hand, a slow, Herculean effort from 2 floors below. I climbed onto the platform when it reached me, my hands gripping the cold rail. The rig descended again, this time with both of us on it, landing us safely on the 10th floor balcony just before one of the support cables snapped. There was no going back up. On our way down, we had passed a floor that was unnervingly silent. Looking through the stairwell window, we saw dozens of bodies lying still on the office carpet. I had whispered that maybe they burn out after a while. Paz had eyed them with suspicion, saying that maybe they were just waiting. Now, on the 10th floor, we found the cafeteria, and we understood. The large room was dark, littered with overturned tables and what appeared to be corpses. I pulled out a floor plan diagram from my jacket, trying to plot a silent path through the bodies to the kitchen exit. Paz's patience wore thin. She saw a first aid station on the far wall and decided to make a run for it. Her movement was the trigger. One of the bodies on the floor snapped its head up, its eyes locking onto her. A low hiss filled the room as dozens of the dormant infected exploded into motion. We fled through the adjoining gym, a chaotic scramble over treadmills and weight benches. In the panic, Paz's foot twisted under her. She cried out in pain but kept moving. We managed to barricade ourselves inside a small utility closet on the 5th floor, but she had a bad sprain. Her ankle was already swelling. She was compromised. Inside the cramped closet, surrounded by the smell of bleach, Paz's fever rose. Her control broke. She looked at me, her eyes bright with pain, and finally spoke of the resentment she had held for years about her mother's final days. "You didn't care if she lived," she accused, her voice raw and cracking. "You just cared that it wasn't on your schedule." Something inside me snapped. The architect's calm, the planner's composure, it all shattered. I gave you a perfect life, I heard myself shouting, my voice echoing in the small space. I designed us a future, and you set fire to the blueprints for a miracle that had a 2% chance of success. That wasn't hope, it was selfishness. Every bitter accusation, every stored piece of poison from our final years together, spilled out into the darkness of the closet. When we were done, there was nothing left to say. We were no longer partners in survival. We were just two people who had failed each other, sitting in the dark, waiting to die. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming. It was the sound of absolute defeat. I could hear the scraping of the dormant infected moving in the hallway outside. After a long time, I opened the first aid kit. I took out a fresh roll of elastic bandage and knelt in front of her. My hands, the same hands that drew blueprints and calculated load-bearing capacities, were surprisingly gentle as I unwrapped her swollen ankle and began to carefully bind it again. The flaw in every system is the people, I said, my voice low, speaking to the floor. I thought I could control for that. I was wrong. Paz watched me, her breathing shallow. Her gaze was clear now, the feverish anger gone. She was seeing me not as her husband, but just as a man forced to admit his life's entire philosophy was a lie. And I thought I could run from everything, she whispered. I thought your plans were a cage. But you don't survive an ER shift without a plan. You just have to be willing to tear it up the second a patient crashes. We did not apologize, we did not forgive. We simply acknowledged the fatal error in our own designs. She had the triage instinct and I had the blueprint. Alone, we were dead. Together, we had a chance. We peered through the dirty glass of a fifth-floor office window, down into the cavernous lobby. Paz was the first to speak. There, she pointed with the barrel of the empty rifle. Dozens of them stood motionless in the gloom, a silent congregation of the damned clustered near the building's main entrance. On the far side of the vast space, a single steel service door was visible, its small red emergency light the only spot of color in the monochrome darkness. It was our only way out. I knew the door was on a magnetic lock tied to the central security system, a system that was now dead. I also knew it had a manual bypass inside the junction box next to it. It would take time we did not have with that many of them standing between me and the door. I turned from the window and saw the answer in my own memory of the building's schematics. I told her about the art installation, a multi-ton sculpture of twisted steel beams and thick glass panels suspended over the exact center of the lobby. It was held by an industrial winch system with a manual override panel, a small metal box and a column on the third floor. My plan was to use it as a diversion. Paz refined it. She said a single crash was not enough. She would create a small sound to draw the nearest ones away, giving me a chance to get down there. Once I was in position at the service door, she would smash the winch controls completely, making the whole thing fall. The resulting catastrophe would be a sustained diversion, a storm of noise and destruction that would draw every one of them to it, giving me the window I needed. It was a plan built on two separate actions, executed in sequence by two people who could not speak to one another. It was a strategy that required absolute faith in the other's timing. We looked at each other in the dim light of the hallway. There was no more argument in her eyes, only a sharp, focused resolve. I gave a single, terse nod. She returned it. We split up without another word, moving into the darkness alone. I waited in the third-floor stairwell, listening. A moment later I heard it, the distinct sound of a glass bottle shattering on the marble floor far to my left. It was her initial diversion. I pushed the stairwell door open and descended, moving as quietly as I could. The lobby was a gallery of statues. I slipped between them, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I reached the service door and pulled the multi-tool from my pocket, prying open the junction box cover. Wires, red, green, black, yellow. My fingers trembled as I began my work. A deep groaning sound echoed from above, the protest of tortured metal. I looked up. Paz had done her part. The massive sculpture shuddered, then detached. It fell, not cleanly, but in a chaotic, grinding descent, crashing into the marble floor with a deafening cataclysm of shattering glass and twisting steel. The sound was absolute. The entire horde of dormant infected, every single one, surged toward the wreckage, a tide of twitching limbs and hungry snarls. It was the window. My fingers flew across the wires, stripping insulation, twisting copper together. I heard a cry of pain from above, sharp and clear even over the din. It was Paz. I glanced up towards the third-floor railing as the small indicator light on the maglock in front of me flashed from red to green. The door was open. My escape was clear, a straight path to the outside, to the suburbs, to the future I had planned. My old self screamed at me to take it, to follow the logic of survival. I looked at the open door, then back into the chaos of the lobby. I made a choice. I left my multi-tool hanging from the wires and sprinted towards a fire axe mounted on the wall. I wrenched it free and ran back into the lobby, away from safety. I found her at the bottom of a short flight of service stairs, her ankle twisted beneath her. 3 of them, their attention not fully captured by the main diversion, were closing in. I did not plan my attack. I just moved, swinging the heavy axe in a brutal, efficient arc. The act was loud and messy, and it saved her life. We leaned on each other, stumbling out of the service exit and into the cold, pre-dawn light. The city was a smoldering ruin, silent except for the wind whistling through shattered skyscrapers. For a moment, our old selves returned. I looked west, toward the suburbs and my vision of a fortified home. Paz looked south, toward the highway that would take her to the coast. The unspoken question of our separate paths hung between us in the gray air. Then we heard it, a new sound cutting through the quiet desolation. From the wreckage of an overturned car nearby, a child was crying. Our heads snapped toward the sound. My plans for a sustainable community and her plans for a coastal escape dissolved into the smoke. We looked at each other, and in that shared glance was a new unspoken contract. Without a word, we turned as one and moved together towards the sound, a single entity walking into the uncertain morning.